How can a Russian story about 7 people being hanged for crimes lead to a spiritual awakening? And what is a spiritual awakening anyway? And what's a higher power? Do you need a higher power to get sober? Let's talk about it. Hi, I'm Cams. I'm an alcoholic. When I was a student at St Andrews University, I never thought that I had an original thought in my brain. I studied Russian language and literature, and I had to write essays on Russian literature from the 18th, the 19th and the 20th centuries. And my essays, to be honest, were never very good. What I used to do is I used to go to the library, get out all of the recommended reading list, make notes, and then try and bring those notes together into a way that sounded original, which it never did. I've already shared about a time when I spent a year in Odessa and how that led to my becoming much more of an alcoholic than I was before. My self-esteem was at a low ebb. I had a presentation to give on a short story author called Andreev, and the story that I had read was called The 7 Who Were Hanged. It's a very, very dark story, all about 7 people that were hanged for crimes. At the end of the story, there's a sense of kind of hopelessness, right? So the presentations at St Andrews were given in small rooms, and it was basically having to stand up in front of a class and present, which brought a new challenge to me because I'd never really performed before. This was before I was used to playing music on stage or anything like that. And to be honest, it freaked me out. It freaked me out so much that I ran away. I jumped on the bus and I went back home to my hometown. I took my books and I spent 4 or 5 days living back at my parents' house and visiting the local library with my books, making notes, and trying to come up with something that would get me through this presentation. So on the day of the presentation, I got the very first bus back to St Andrews at dark o'clock, feeling a real sense of foreboding, thinking to myself, how am I going to go through with this? The bus goes through lots of little towns in Fife. Now, if you've never been to Fife, it's a beautiful part of Scotland. East coast, farmland, hills. It's just a beautiful part of the country. And the bus goes through all these little windy villages in Fife, one of which is called Kettle Bridge. Tiny place. And as the bus was going through Kettle Bridge, the sun came up. Now, out over to my right, there was a hill and a copse of trees on top of the hill, and the sun came up just behind that hill and shone through the trees. And that was when I had my first spiritual awakening. I'd heard of spiritual awakenings before, I think, but I don't think I had ever had one. It was a very special moment that I'm actually going to struggle to describe to you, but I'm going to try. I was reading the book, and at the end of the book, as I've said, there's a sense of hopelessness, right? And when the sun came up, I got this feeling of belonging to the whole. There was a sense of harmony, and harmony is the word that I've come to use to describe that. I've looked back at that moment a lot throughout my years of continued drinking and then into sobriety. And I feel like that was the moment when the seed was planted in my brain that there was something bigger than me. Now, growing up, I had never been particularly religious, and I couldn't have told you whether I believed in God or not. I just knew that I felt something. I looked back at the notes that I'd made for my presentation, and I looked at the end of the story when the 7 are hanged, and the passage that comes after that. So I'm going to read that to you now. The bodies were placed in a box. Then they were taken away. With stretched necks, with bulging eyes, with blue swollen tongues, looking like some unknown terrible flowers between the lips, which were covered with bloody foam, the bodies were hurried back along the same road by which they had come alive. And the spring snow was just as soft and fresh. The spring air was just as strong and fragrant. And on the snow lay Sergei's black rubber shoe, wet, trampled underfoot. Thus did men greet the rising sun. So imagine I'm sitting on a bus with the rising sun coming up beside me over these trees, and I read that line, "Thus did men greet the rising sun." And I was filled with a real sense of hope. So let's go back a bit. And the spring snow was just as soft and fresh. The spring air was just as strong and fragrant. So what I took from that was the idea that death brings you back into the whole, into that harmony that I was getting a sense of coming over the hills with the sunrise. And I was filled with a moment of pure and utter joy, the likes of which I'd never felt before. And I took that sense of hope and I put it down on paper, and I started frantically writing, looking back at the notes I'd made, trying to bring some of the points into this whole new perspective, from hopelessness to hope. And when I got to St Andrews, I had rewritten the whole thing. I felt ready to present, and I got a first for that presentation. Dr. Keyes said that he disagreed with me, but that I had presented some original thought and I had backed it up using examples from the book, and that was precisely what the whole purpose of doing a presentation or an essay was all about. So imagine somebody with low self-esteem and never an original thought in their brain suddenly gets a spiritual awakening moment as the sun comes up in a tiny little village in Fife, sitting on the bus early in the morning. I continued drinking after that for many years. In fact, that was 1998. I got sober in 2005, so I had a lot more years of drinking to come. I remember sitting with friends explaining this concept to them while drunk. That kind of concept evolved through my drunkenness, through my drinking years, and into sobriety. So when I got into the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous and I heard these terms, spiritual awakening, so step 12, having had a spiritual awakening as the result of these steps, the concept of a higher power, came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. These were concepts that I was able to kind of understand from the beginning. I know that a lot of people have trouble with these concepts when they get into the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous, and that's completely understandable. So I guess in a way I was lucky that I had already considered these things before I got there, because when I got into AA, I heard of a higher power and I grasped onto it. I knew that I was not in control of my drinking. I was not in control of anything, really, if I'm honest. It wasn't a difficult thing for me to grasp. That has carried me forward, and it's continued to evolve, and I'm sure it will continue to evolve as I grow into my sobriety. Sobriety is a thing that grows, and it's limitless. There can never be enough sobriety. There can never be enough serenity. And I am so grateful that I have that in my life now. The pain of alcoholism is real, but there's hope, and that's why I'm here. I'm here to share my experience, my strength, and my hope with you, that we may solve our common problem. If you've got any value from listening to this video, please show that by clicking the like button, because that will help me to see what kind of content resonates. If you're a still suffering alcoholic, or you're in recovery, and you would like to get in touch, then leave a comment and I will get back to you. Or hit me up on Twitter @Camuel. I would love to start a dialogue with other alcoholics and to have some of your experience, strength and hope if you're willing to share it. Remember, you're not alone.